The Rock's relentless drive for success isn't just ambition, it's survival instinct born from a childhood trauma so deep, even his family doesn't know. And when the truth finally came out, it changed everything they thought they knew about Dwayne Johnson. November 3, 1980. Honolulu, Hawaii. 8-year-old Dwayne Johnson was walking home from Roosevelt Elementary School when his world shattered in a way that would define every single day of his life for the next 4 decades. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and little Dwayne was excited because his father, Rocky Johnson, had promised to take him to wrestling practice that evening. His mother, Ada, was supposed to pick him up, but she was running late from her job at the hotel. So Dwayne decided to walk the familiar route home, just like he'd done dozens of times before. But this walk would be different. As he turned the corner onto Keaumoku Street, Dwayne noticed a rusty blue van parked near the bus stop. The engine was running, and through the tinted windows, he could see the outline of a man watching him. Something about the way the van had been positioned made his 8-year-old instinct scream danger. What happened in the next 17 minutes would create the psychological foundation for everything Dwayne Johnson would become, and everything he would fear losing. The man in the van was Thomas Mitchell, a 34-year-old drifter who had been watching Dwayne for 3 weeks. Mitchell had learned the boy's routine, knew his family's schedule, and had been waiting for exactly this moment, when Dwayne would be alone and vulnerable. As Dwayne walked past the van, trying to appear calm while his heart pounded, Mitchell stepped out. "Hey kid," Mitchell called out, his voice friendly but his eyes cold. "Your dad sent me to pick you up. There's been an emergency at home." 8-year-old Dwayne stopped walking. Every instinct in his body told him to run, but the mention of his father confused him. What if there really was an emergency? What if his mom or dad was hurt? "I don't know you," Dwayne said, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. Mitchell smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Your dad's Rocky Johnson, right? The wrestler? He told me to tell you about the time he fought Andre the Giant in Madison Square Garden. That's how you'll know he sent me." Dwayne's blood went cold. His father had told him that story just the night before. How could this stranger know about it? What Dwayne didn't realize was that Mitchell had been stalking not just him, but his entire family. He'd been listening to their conversations through open windows, following Rocky to wrestling events, and gathering information that would make him seem trustworthy to an 8-year-old boy. "Come on, kid," Mitchell said, walking closer. "We need to go. Your mom's been in an accident." That's when something inside Dwayne Johnson awakened. Something that would drive him for the rest of his life. Instead of getting scared, instead of freezing, instead of believing the lie, Dwayne did something that shocked even himself. He looked Mitchell directly in the eyes and said, "You're lying. My dad would never send someone I don't know. And if my mom was really hurt, you'd take me to the hospital, not make me get in your van." Mitchell's friendly mask dropped completely. His face twisted with anger and frustration. "Listen, you little brat, you're coming with me whether you like it or not." He lunged forward to grab Dwayne's arm. But Dwayne was already running. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his 8 years of life. Behind him, he could hear Mitchell's heavy footsteps and shouted curses. The van's engine roared to life, and Dwayne knew that in seconds, Mitchell would be chasing him down the street. That's when Dwayne made a decision that would save his life and haunt his dreams for decades. Instead of running straight home, where Mitchell might follow him and discover where he lived, Dwayne ran toward the busiest street he could think of. He ran toward King Street, where there would be traffic, witnesses, and safety. His lungs burned. His school backpack bounced against his spine. His sneakers slapped against the concrete in a rhythm that would echo in his nightmares for years to come. But he didn't stop running until he reached the crowded intersection near Ala Moana Center. Only then did he turn around. The blue van was nowhere to be seen. Dwayne collapsed on the sidewalk, sobbing and shaking as concerned strangers rushed to help him. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, he could barely speak through his tears to tell them what had happened. But here's the part that would scar him forever, the part that even his family never fully understood. The police never found Thomas Mitchell. The blue van was discovered abandoned 3 days later in a Kalihi parking lot, but Mitchell had vanished completely. For weeks, Dwayne lived in terror that the man would come back for him. Every blue van made his heart race. Every stranger who looked at him too long made him want to run. But worse than the fear was the realization that had crystallized in his 8-year-old mind during those 17 minutes of terror. He was completely powerless. Mitchell had been bigger, stronger, and smarter. If Dwayne hadn't been lucky enough to think quickly and run fast, he would have been taken. And once he was taken, there would have been nothing, absolutely nothing he could have done to save himself. That night, as his parents tucked him into bed and promised him he was safe, Dwayne made a promise to himself that would shape every decision he'd make for the next 40 years. He would never be powerless again. The trauma manifested in ways that his family attributed to normal childhood anxiety. Dwayne became obsessed with knowing where his parents were at all times. He memorized multiple routes home from every location. He started paying attention to every person around him, cataloging potential threats and escape routes. But most importantly, he became obsessed with getting bigger and stronger. At age 9, Dwayne started doing push-ups and sit-ups in his bedroom every night. At 10, he was begging his father to teach him wrestling moves. By 12, he was lifting weights and studying martial arts. His parents thought it was wonderful that their son was so dedicated to fitness and athletics. They had no idea he was training to never be a victim again. The drive that would make Dwayne Johnson a wrestling champion, a movie star, and a business mogul wasn't born from ambition or ego. It was born from pure survival instinct, the desperate need to become so strong, so successful, so powerful that no one could ever make him feel helpless again. But carrying that trauma alone for decades came with a cost that nobody understood. In high school, Dwayne's friends couldn't understand why he trained so obsessively. Why he needed to be the biggest, strongest guy in every room. Why he couldn't relax, couldn't just be a normal teenager. They thought he was driven by dreams of sports success. He never told them he was driven by nightmares of blue vans and predatory strangers. In college, his football teammates were amazed by his work ethic and determination. They thought he was just naturally competitive. They didn't know that every time he lifted weights, every time he pushed his body to its limits, he was exorcising demons that had been chasing him since he was 8 years old. In WWE, his colleagues attributed his incredible charisma and intensity to natural talent and showmanship. They had no idea that every time he stepped into that ring, he was proving to himself that he could defend against any threat, could overcome any opponent, could never be overpowered again. And in Hollywood, directors and producers marveled at his work ethic, his preparation, his absolute refusal to show weakness or vulnerability in any role. They thought it was just professionalism. They didn't realize they were watching a man who had spent his entire life building armor against a trauma he'd never shared with anyone. The secret eating away at him wasn't just about that day in 1980. It was about all the ways that trauma had shaped him, driven him, and ultimately isolated him from the people he loved most. Because here's what nobody understood about Dwayne Johnson's success. It wasn't really about achieving his dreams. It was about outrunning his nightmares. Every movie deal, every business venture, every social media post radiating positivity and strength was another way of proving to that 8-year-old boy inside him that he was safe now. That he was powerful now. That Thomas Mitchell and men like him could never hurt him again. But the more successful he became, the more he had to lose. And the more he had to lose, the more terrified he became of someone taking it all away. The breaking point came in 2019, during what should have been one of the happiest periods of his life. Dwayne was at the peak of his career. Hobbs Shaw had just hit theaters. His production company was worth hundreds of millions. His family was healthy and happy. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built as protection against his childhood trauma, was finally complete. But instead of feeling safe and accomplished, Dwayne found himself paralyzed by a new kind of fear. What if he lost it all? What if someone more powerful, more ruthless, more cunning came along and destroyed everything he'd built? The panic attack started small. A racing heart during business meetings. Sweaty palms before public appearances. Difficulty sleeping, even in his heavily secured mansion. But they got worse. Much worse. The night everything changed was October 15, 2019. Dwayne was alone in his home gym at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, pushing through his third workout of the day. He was bench pressing 405 pounds, a weight that should have been routine for him, when suddenly he couldn't breathe. But this wasn't a physical problem. This was his 8-year-old self, finally breaking through 4 decades of carefully constructed armor. As he lay on that bench, gasping for air, Dwayne was transported back to Keamoku Street. He could smell the exhaust from Mitchell's van. He could hear the man's voice calling his name. He could feel the terror of being completely powerless, completely vulnerable, completely alone. For the first time in 40 years, The Rock couldn't muscle his way through the fear. He called his mother at 3:17 a.m., sobbing so hard he could barely speak. Ada Johnson had never heard her son cry like that, not since he was 8 years old and came home shaking from his encounter with a stranger in a blue van. "Mom," he whispered into the phone, "I think I need help. I think I've been running from something for so long that I forgot how to stop." That conversation led to 18 months of therapy that would fundamentally change how Dwayne Johnson understood himself and his success. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma specialist who had worked with other high achievers, helped Dwayne finally confront the truth he'd been avoiding for decades. His incredible success hadn't healed his childhood trauma, it had amplified it. "You've spent 40 years building walls, Dr. Martinez told him during one session. But walls that keep threats out also keep healing out. And they keep authentic connection out. You've become so good at being invulnerable that you've forgotten how to be human." The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez asked Dwayne to do something that terrified him more than any movie stunt or wrestling match: to tell his family the truth about why he'd really become The Rock. The conversation with Lauren and his daughters was the hardest thing Dwayne had ever done. Harder than any workout, any role, any business negotiation. Because it required him to be the one thing he'd spent his entire life learning not to be: vulnerable. "I never told you the real reason I work so hard," he said, his voice shaking as he sat in their living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon. "It's not because I love success. It's because I'm terrified of being powerless." He told them about Thomas Mitchell. About the blue van. About the 17 minutes that had shaped 40 years of his life. About how every achievement, every dollar earned, every muscle built had been his way of ensuring that 8-year-old boy would never be scared again. His daughters listened with tears in their eyes, finally understanding why their father seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Lauren held his hand as he spoke, realizing that the man she'd fallen in love with had been protecting not just his family, but a frightened child who had been hiding inside him all along. But the most important part of that conversation wasn't about the trauma. It was about what happened next. "Dad," his daughter Simone said quietly, "you saved yourself that day. You were 8 years old, and you were smarter and braver than a grown man who wanted to hurt you. You didn't become strong in spite of what happened to you. You were already strong. That's why you survived." For the first time in 40 years, Dwayne Johnson saw his childhood trauma differently. Not as evidence of his powerlessness, but as proof of his strength. Not as something that had broken him, but as something that had revealed who he really was even at 8 years old. Someone who would never give up, never give in, never stop fighting for himself and the people he loved. The healing didn't happen overnight. Dwayne still struggled with anxiety, still caught himself building unnecessary defenses against imaginary threats. But something fundamental had shifted. His workouts became about health and enjoyment, not compulsive protection. His business decisions became about passion and creativity, not just accumulating power. His relationships became about connection and vulnerability, not just providing security. Most importantly, he started talking about mental health openly. Not because it was good for his brand, but because he realized there were other 8-year-olds out there, and other adults still carrying those 8-year-olds inside them, who needed to know they weren't alone. The first time Dwayne shared his story publicly was during a 2020 interview where he was supposed to be promoting his latest film. Instead, he spent 30 minutes talking about childhood trauma, therapy, and the difference between strength and invulnerability. "I thought being strong meant never being scared," he said. "But real strength is being scared and choosing to be brave anyway. Real strength is asking for help. Real strength is admitting that the little kid inside you still needs reassurance that he's safe." The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out to share their own stories of childhood trauma and adult overcompensation. Parents talked about recognizing similar patterns in their own children. Therapists reported an influx of clients who said Dwayne's openness had given them permission to seek help. But the response that mattered most came from an unexpected source. 3 months after that interview aired, Dwayne received a letter from the Honolulu Police Department. Thomas Mitchell had finally been caught, not for what he'd tried to do to Dwayne, but for crimes he'd committed against other children in the decades since. He was now serving a life sentence in a California prison. "Mr. Johnson," the detective wrote, "your public story about your encounter with Mitchell helped us connect several cold cases. Other victims came forward because they heard you speak about what happened. Your courage to share your trauma helped us get a predator off the streets permanently." That letter sits framed in Dwayne's office today. Not as a trophy of his success, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is admit you were once powerless. The 8-year-old boy who ran from a blue van in 1980 had grown up to become one of the most powerful men in entertainment. But his real strength wasn't in his muscles, his money, or his fame. It was in his willingness to stop running from his own fear and start walking toward healing. Thomas Mitchell had tried to steal Dwayne Johnson's childhood sense of safety. Instead, he'd accidentally created one of the most resilient, determined, and ultimately compassionate people on the planet. The trauma that was meant to break him had forged him into someone who could help others heal from their own broken places. Today, when Dwayne talks about his why, the driving force behind his success, he doesn't mention box office numbers or business deals. He talks about that 8-year-old boy who was smart enough and brave enough to save himself, and who deserved to grow up feeling proud of his courage instead of ashamed of his fear. The Rock's relentless drive for success had always been about more than ambition. It was about survival, protection, and proving that no one could ever make him feel small again. But the most important lesson he learned was that healing that 8-year-old boy didn't require becoming invulnerable. It required becoming human. And in the end, that's exactly what made him a hero worth following.